Johnny.
Hello, Aubrey. How are you?
I'm well. And yourself?
So you look jolly. That's always good.
Yeah, life's good. I'm hidden away in my mountain hideaway, so it's all right.
Have you got any company?
Yeah, my fiance's here.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, that's good. So I wanted to sort of take you back to when, because we've been talking about the movie for a while, and then I'm sure that I hadn't given you a full picture, and then I sent you the film, and then I wanted to, I guess, what was your first reaction in watching the film?
I think I pretty much wrote it down at the time. I was blown away. I mean, the thing is, like, I don't think there's any film that is even remotely similar, ever. You know, the idea of actually combining an autobiography and a documentary and a science fiction story all in one package. You know, anyone with any common sense whatsoever would say that's obviously completely impossible. It's going to be a complete clusterfuck. And you made it work. You made it work spectacularly. So yeah, I was blown away.
And it wouldn't be fair not to mention my editor and cinematographer, Paul, who stood by me when I was pulling my hair out and really, you know, along the whole journey. So I had a lot of help. So I can't, we're not islands. We'll go back to that. So when I first sort of pitched it to you, I know I only gave you pieces because I was worried. I was very anxious about I was anxious about sort of the manipulative process of it, because I didn't want to give too much away. As you were sort of on the journey with me, and you were on, actually, I think, if not initially, certainly in the beginnings, how was it different than what you'd imagined? Because I'd only given you pieces.
Right. I mean, I don't think there was any particular component that I was not expecting to be there, or something I was expecting to be there that wasn't, or anything like that. You know, I'm not a film buff or anything, so I don't really, and I don't have experience in the industry, of course, so I didn't really have any prior expectations going in. Obviously, I was aware of FM as a person, you know, and his contributions to futurism in general, and so on. And I therefore was excited that someone who had not only met him, but had also, you know, been very strongly influenced by him, was going out and making a movie about that. So, you know, I was definitely, you know, I had a strong feeling of, you know, I was really looking forward to seeing what happened, but I really had no idea what it was going to turn out like. And so, you know, I mean, I guess I was really imagining it as being predominantly a documentary, and the fact that you were able to make the documentary component, you know, be essentially at an equal footing with the science fiction component and with the autobiographical component, you know, that was completely out of the blue for me. So
yeah, I mean, obviously you wrote, I think after his suspension, you wrote his last book, you wrote the introduction. So you knew a little bit about FM. Was there anything?
Hang on, stop there. I did I?
Yeah, you did.
I remember now, there was that posthumous book that,
yeah.
I'd never heard of FM in 2000. Right, no, I'd forgotten that I'd written that, okay.
So you wrote the intro to Countdown to Immortality, which, you know, obviously was ironic on many levels, and that was your first probably introduction. What did the film give you that perhaps you didn't know about FM? What were some of the things you may have learned that you hadn't learned?
Well, that's a good question. Not all that much, actually, because you know, I had little fragments of snippets of information about FM from various sources over the years. I hadn't really made any kind of effort to put them together, you know, to actually form an impression of FM. Like, for example, I do remember I was sent a couple of his earlier books, at some point. But when I was watching the movie, I wasn't really watching it with the goal of forming a more rounded impression of FM. I was really taking it on its, taking the movie, you know, on its face. I was just as like drawn into the autobiographical aspect as I was into the documentary aspect.
So was there anything that surprised you in sort of having it unfold in that way? I mean, in terms of, I guess in terms of, I mean, because there's lots of things where you and various other people in what we'll call the futurist movement, a lot of these things have sort of been adopted or taken on. I mean, silly things like, you know, there are lots of people, particularly where you are right now or in that vicinity, taking on sort of a vegetarian stance or a sort of equality or even universal basic income, for example. So were there things around that you sort of put together that?
I wouldn't say put together. I would say more a case of I was either being told or being reminded that FM had talked about such things at an earlier stage than pretty much anybody else. And you know, and especially something like universal basic income, which is a you know, an almost inescapable logical consequence of something that we all know is going to happen, namely very ubiquitous automation. You know, the idea that it was ever not obvious is interesting. And of course, it somewhat parallels my own situation with regard to the idea that aging is a medical problem, which apparently was not obvious to other people. You know, so in that sense, yes, but it was more like these things didn't really dominate what was going on in my head when I watched the movie, because they kind of just all fitted into place already. You know, they didn't have to alter my overall framework, so to speak. So really, what was going on in my head when I was watching the movie was the building up of this absolute awe at how the components of the movie that really should not be compatible at all were being made compatible.
The process was, if this was a big Hollywood film, what would happen? Like what would be the relationships, and then how can we dial it back to make it a documentary? And ironically, now we you know, some of those themes, particularly the commoditization of healthcare, really, and how only certain people. I mean, I just read this story about how, you know, there are multimillionaires who are getting corona tests, you know, left, right, and center, and yet there are people in, well, not just Ohio or Kentucky, but I mean, even here in Connecticut, in underprivileged towns who can't get tested. I mean, so it's ironic that there's so much of these things that we really did pluck from Hollywood to make these sort of arch villains, and now sort of in the headlines. I mean, was that? I mean, I would have thought that a lot of people, actually even you, would be like, oh, that isn't really a thing.
That's a tricky one for me, because I tend to kind of make allowances for the lack of prescience of the rest of the world. You know, I tend to just live on the basis that we can't all be prescient, you know, and things that, I mean, so most of the things that FM said that had hardly been said at all, if at all, before, are things that I kind of grew up understanding as common sense, not because I'd read FM, just because I was, I guess, the same kind of person, right? And therefore, you know, I have kind of got used to the fact that the world takes a while to catch up, and I've also got used to not letting that fact slow me down. So it's more, from my point of view, it's when I'm reading FM, or when I'm looking at a documentary about him, or other futurists for that matter, but in this case FM, it's really more of a feeling of identity, you know, feeling this is my kind of person.
Well, in what ways do you think you're? I mean, I remember when I first met you, you seemed, and I think you're, not my opinion of you, but what I know of you has changed. It's more robust, and I've seen different sides to you. But what do you think the similarities, not just in your sort of worldview or even your foresightedness, if that's even the term, but what do you think are the similarities and all the differences?
You mean between me and FM?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'd say the similarities are pretty easy to identify. I simply don't I don't make the naturalistic fallacy. You know, I don't presume that the way things are is the way they ought to be, or indeed is the way that they must forever be. I start out from first principles saying, well, okay, would it be a better world if such and such were no longer the case? And then I have a look and decide whether it could be no longer the case, you know, whether there are technological routes towards making it no longer the case. You know, that's really, to my mind, all that any futurist does who's doing it right. And it's certainly what FM did. So that's really the underpinning of what I said a moment ago about having a sense of identity.
When I was first getting to know FM, there would be these articles and he would then be slammed in the press. I mean, I remember there was this article that he wrote in the early 70s that I read later, but I remember laughing at it myself because it was this article about how there were going to be, it didn't call it 3D printers, but there was going to be this machine and you put raw materials in it, it would print things. And I think it was the New York Times said that it was a Father Christmas machine and he believes this and it's just, you're gonna, and they was basically laughing at him. And it didn't seem affected by it at all. And I'm sure you encounter some of that yourself, like where people think that you're being cavalier or at least being slight about some of these things that are going to happen. What do you think the difference was then as it is now for you as you're making?
Great question. So of course, in my world, where I'm really only talking publicly anyway about one particular part of the future, namely the elimination of aging, you know, I've basically, you know, to a large extent, I have moved through that phase. These days, people don't really laugh very much at the idea that aging is a medical problem that could be solved in the foreseeable future. A lot of people don't think it's true, but they don't think it's so ridiculous as to be laughable. Whereas 15 years ago, they certainly did. Now, back then, I'd like to say two things about this. Number one, it didn't bother me either back then, largely because I could see that the only reason people were laughing was because they didn't know or understand enough about the technological side. You know, not everyone can be an expert on things. And of course, I understood that if you don't know enough about the details, then you're bound to find it laughable. Fine. However, in addition to that, I think one thing I really want to emphasize that is very much in common with FM is he was doing it earlier, as well as doing it on a broader scale, talking about a wide range of different types of futurism. So if we look at my field, the biology of aging, people have got into this ridiculous habit these days of actually describing me as the first person who came along and said aging is a medical problem and we ought to fix it and we probably can, right? Complete nonsense. You know, before me, there were people doing this in a much more unfriendly environment. Cynthia Kenyon was really the person who came, you know, who was previous to me. She made a name for herself in the field in 1993 by demonstrating that one could double the lifespan of nematode worm. And that shot her to prominence, and she used that prominence not only for her own career, but also to to highlight the fact that aging is a medical problem that we ought to try to fix, which was absolutely the third rail back then. You should not be able to get away with saying things like that. And she was doing it before she even had tenure at UC San Francisco. So I enormously admire Cynthia for that. And before her, a decade earlier than that, there was Michael Rose, who kind of was not so vulnerable because he's an evolutionary biologist, and therefore, you know, he moves in different circles, and talking about the elimination of aging is something that would not be seen as politically so incendiary in his circles as it would be elsewhere, but still fairly incendiary. And yeah, he was perfectly happy to get up and use the fact that he became quite prominent by extending the lifespan of fruit flies in the 1980s. You know, and to talk about this. and before him, there was Denham Harman, who came up with the free radical theory of aging, the first time anyone had come up with a really concrete biochemical hypothesis for how the damage that we accumulate in our bodies actually gets generated. And he, in 1970, he got into a huge fight with the rest of the gerontological establishment in the US, to the point that he actually left the Gerontological Society of America, the main learned society in this field, and created his own breakaway organization called the American Aging Association, which is now, the most important biology of aging organization in the world, but took a long time. For a long time, it was a real fringe movement. So, I'm really totally standing on the shoulders of giants in all of this. And if I compare FM to that group of people, he was operating at that kind of time, 70s, 80s, 90s, and he was doing so across the board of futurism. So he was being laughed at by everybody, right? And yet, I can totally understand why he didn't find that particularly daunting, and he just, took it as inevitable.
One of the things that we chose, really, this idea that he was going to be brought back, number one, because I think that is inevitable, even though, we could get into some of the specifics of, how and why, but really but to me, a lot of the things that he talked about in terms of the relevance for me as a human being, as a parent, as a brother, as a father, as all of these things were these more characterological, more, I guess if we're going to drill down, more of a sort of mindset. I mean, how much do you think those things are still relevant? I mean, he called it this sort of idea that, number one, what was it? Optimism, abundance, universalism, and immortality. It was these four prongs. I don't think he ever said that that you'd have to achieve all of them to achieve the final one. But I think he would have felt that some of those things had to happen in order for us as a species to get to that place. How do you feel about those as pillars for you to achieve the goal that you're working on?
I don't disagree with what he said about that kind of thing, but it's not really foremost in my mind. It's not really what motivates me and drives me. I think really, I prefer to think of these technologies, including the longevity one that I work on, as a continuum, as simply an extension of the process of enhancing the human condition with technology that has gone on since the Stone Age. And so I sometimes describe myself as a first things first kind of guy, right? So I don't really I don't really have a frame of mind that revolves around a qualitative, transition that might occur in the human condition. I think of it as, just a progression.
And yet you're very focused on the PR war, which in a sense builds into these other strands. Because I think if you were just, okay, well, the first things first is, okay, I'm going to sit in the lab and I'm going to show the world that these experiments work and I'm going to get covered. I mean, you're more aware than what I would call a very myopic scientist. I mean, you have this idea that this isn't going to happen in a bubble. This isn't just going to happen in a lab. I mean, there's that too, right? I mean,
yes. So let me try to amplify what I meant by being a first things first kind of guy. So I am very much the kind of person who likes to know where I'm eventually going. I think you can't be a pioneering technologist that gets things done unless you have a sense of the goal, following which you put the stepping stones in place. You figure out how a plausible route to the goal, consisting of manageable size steps. But then I get on with the first step and then the next step and so on. Now, I think that applies at the PR level as well as at the technical level. So, for example, I've always felt that it's a poor use of my time to try to influence the political elite, because the political elite essentially have only one goal in life, which is to get re-elected. And, you know, they're not going to do that. They're not going to be, they might be terribly nice to me, but they won't actually do anything useful unless they think there are votes in it. So I've always focused on doing media and doing, educating the general public so as to educate the policymakers and politicians of the world, you know, as a result. Now, that seems to be a sensible way to go. And right now, we're probably just at the beginning of being able to influence the political elite, because the public attitude to the whole idea of aging being a medical problem is now becoming more positive and more sympathetic. Same kind of applied a few years prior to the commercial world. So most of what needed to be done, even though it was clearly going to make a huge amount of money in the end, was at a sufficiently early stage that you just didn't know what particular technology was going to work. And therefore, you know, it needed to be de-risked to a certain degree before even the most early stage angel investors, seed investors would be interested in coming in. So that, of course, started to happen about 5 years ago. And now it's exploding, and it's almost got a life of its own right now. And I spend a lot of my time helping that along. But the point is, it could not have happened 15 years ago because the science just wasn't ready.
Some of even people that you connected me with had a problem with, I guess, I don't want to even say the theme, some of the plot. I mean, why did you sort of look past that in terms of, you know, this organization that was only concerned about profit, for example? I mean, I don't know, what were the themes particularly that appealed to you, you know, either because you were lost in the film or from a sort of macro level in terms of what you do?
Yeah, tricky one. I mean, I wouldn't say there were any particular themes that particularly appealed to me. It was more a case of the absence of things that didn't appeal to me. You know, I mean, you were saying that other people that you showed the movie to, there were things that they hung up on. There just wasn't anything that I hung up on.
Well, I guess the one that's sort of standing out is a guy that seemed really gung-ho, and he dropped lots of names. I'm not going to mention his name, and I actually can't remember it. But he was nice. He was fun. I mean, we had a nice chat. And then he watched the movie, and he called me, and he said, you know, don't think I can really get behind this because it makes it sound like all the technology is in the hands of these uncaring, immoral people that have only got one thing and one thing. You know, he really framed it in this way rather than sort of seeing past that and seeing, I guess what, it's a hard question to sort of answer internally. You saw sort of past that, which is what I was hoping for. I'm wondering, why do you think some people do latch on to, oh my God, there's, you know, so-and-so's a villain. So, you know, because it reminded me of what it was like doing these big projects with studios and brands, and everybody had their own sort of opinion. This isn't on brand and that's not on brand. And so their brand was, you know, we want everybody to embrace immortality or cryonics or whatever it was. And because it had this one thread, they couldn't see past it. I mean, but that's part of the humanity. I'm sure you get that.
Yeah, perhaps that's just something about me that I don't really have you know, I don't really think in terms of brands in the first place. And, you know, for example, I don't have any particular, I wouldn't regard myself as particularly either capitalist or socialist. You know, I see benefits in all of these things. So I don't have a particular bias in favor of or against the delivery of such and such a medical technology by private companies. I just think, you know, this is something that is going to be worked out one way or another, you know, and everyone's going to benefit.
There's another big thing that we really kept front and center, which was this idea of, and it was really, that was, if there was any homage to FM, it was, can we make a film that's about the future, that's dramatic, that has conflict, but isn't dystopian? I mean, that was really our goal. I mean, if there was any sort of macro goal in this, it was, yes, we wanted to talk about some of the ideas and how we got there, but if there was one thing that we really did want to keep in mind, we wanted there to be conflict and people to be immersed. but we didn't want it to be, oh my God, the world's coming to an end and there's going to be robots that are trying to kill us and FM's going to come back and kill everybody. You know, we wanted to stay away from those sorts of things. Why do you think that's rare? And
I can tell you exactly why it's rare. It's rare because people who make movies tend to make movies that they think will sell. And that means they want to make movies that reinforce the prejudices that the public already has, so that the public will leave the movie feeling good, right? Now, of course, one of the feelings that the public already has is fear of the unknown. And not only that, but also fear of getting their hopes up in terms of something that they would like to see in the future, but they don't know how soon it's going to come, right? So in the case of my focus, which is of course aging, you know, there's a movie comes out every couple of years that is a complete blockbuster and that paints a ridiculously dystopic picture of a world in which aging has been brought under medical control, but it has created some new problem, like everyone gets shot when they reach the age of 30 or whatever it might be, right?
Fed to each other.
What?
Or fed to each other, you know.
That's right, yeah. So an Australian academic did actually a study on this several years ago. I got her to speak at one of my conferences about this. She looked at basically all the movies that had looked at, that had explored a post-aging world and how they did it. And there was basically almost nothing that was not dystopic. There were just a few things that were kind of marginal. It's terrible. But here's the thing. Of course, yes, a movie does have to have a dramatic element to it. And so one has to be a little creative in order to figure out, you know, how to do that without starting from some arbitrary dystopic scenario. And I think it's not very hard. You know, we'll just have to have a little bit of thought and not be so bloody lazy, really. So the next movie you're going to make will go like this. Ready?
Yeah.
This is a plot that I came up with years ago, and I've been getting people interested in it ever since, but no one's actually made it yet. So here it goes. The movie begins with a post-aging world, but it's a post-aging world in which everything is fine. You know, nothing's actually gone wrong. Okay, it's you know, it's been a post-aging world for a while, and everything's hunky-dory. And then what happens is aging comes back. There's some virus that comes along that gives people aging again, right? And because people are familiar with the idea that aging doesn't exist, right, even though it used to, it is treated like a disease, like a medical problem, like, right? And therefore, there's plenty of panic and, you know, global efforts to develop ways to bring it under control again and get rid of it. And so there's plenty of opportunity for dramatic element there, right? And perhaps this is even more plausible now, more attractive now as a plot, you know, given the current coronavirus thing. But yeah, I mean, you know, this way one ends up, you know, not only not reinforcing the, you know, the pro-death prejudices, but actually the opposite. One is, you know, essentially reinforcing by default, ex silentio, the idea that thinking aging is a good thing or a blessing in disguise is ridiculous.
And so you've been pitching this, and what are some of the ideas for conflict that people have come up with as you pitch this in the new effort to do away with aging once we've already been in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy, isn't it? You can have, you know, you can perfectly well have romantic interests, you know, some attractive female scientist who's at the forefront of everything, you know, and some evil politician who's trying to keep things, trying to let everybody die, you know, whatever.
Are there other depictions of the future that you think are being ignored, either in films or in popular culture?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I mean, of course, it's all relative. You know, every pioneering technology, whether it's a post-aging world or a world in which nobody has to work anymore, or whether it's a world in which you know, we don't have any wars anymore, things like that. You know, all of these things are somewhat explored, and of course, as technology brings us closer to developing such things, people think about them more, and in particular, they think about them more seriously. Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things go together.
In terms of, I mean, you've indicated that there are already shifts happening that make your work at least accepted, and at least there are people that are going to fund it, or at least going to fund it more than they would 10, 15 years ago. What are sort of, if you had to either think either in terms of some of the things FM talked about or other futurists have talked about, what do you think is going to be the biggest shift where, you know, the work that you do is going to be, you know, government fund? I mean, again, I'm not going to create sort of a utopian scenario for you, but I'm sure you've thought of lots of funding comes in, lots of ways that would make your job easier and the job of scientists like yourselves.
I don't think there's any one answer to that. I think that the process is going to continue to be what it has been for the past 10 or 15 years, namely every little incremental advance that happens in the laboratory and that gets out and gets widely known makes an incremental increase in the number of people who take this seriously, and they bring and you know, and also who you know, who are positively disposed towards it, and not just increase the number of people, but also increase the intensity of that enthusiasm among the people who are already slightly enthusiastic. So it's all incremental, and there may indeed be a tipping point where things happen very suddenly. And I believe actually there's likely to be such a tipping point in public opinion, which other people, not only scientists, but in particular policymakers and decision makers, need to be ready for. But really it's all going to be, as a result, it's all going to be driven by the necessarily incremental progress that happens in the laboratory, because science is just hard. Science never goes fast, right? You know, yes, what's going to happen is that my job will increasingly become unnecessary, which suits me fine. But exactly when and how, I am very reluctant to predict. Not least because the only one time I ever did predict it, I got it completely wrong. What happened was that 14 years ago, I had my first success in terms of bringing in a very high net worth individual to put substantial money, well, what was then substantial, behind this whole thing. That was Peter Thiel, who started giving us $1 million a year. And that was in 2006. And he was not just known to be, you know, very techno-friendly, he was also very, very high reputationally. His hedge fund was the most successful in the world and so on. So I totally thought, you know, my fundraising job is done, you know, because all the other billionaires are going to be lining up, you know, because obviously, you know, he wasn't doing it anonymously or anything. And I was completely wrong. It took another like 4 years before anyone came in at the same kind of level of funding, and another 6 years after that before the next one came in. So yeah, it was, I was completely wrong. So I'm not making any predictions right now.
Do you think that was more because he was known to be this sort of contrarian, or do you think it just because the world wasn't ready? I mean, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, a bit of both. I mean, really, they're not even really distinct explanations. They're kind of two sides of the same explanation, if you like. You know, the fact that someone who thinks that way is viewed as a contrarian is because the world isn't ready, in the same way that FM was considered a contrarian.
So to sort of shift gears, but only slightly, you know, FM, I mean, I keep thinking about what FM would have thought of this. What's your view on what's happening, the response, whether this could be, if not the tipping point, a tipping point in terms of more progressive thought? Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I've thought about this a lot. What's your sort of sense?
Maybe I don't understand your question, but if you're
I'm talking about, we're living in a world where suddenly the whole world is shut down, or at least big parts of it. And there's obviously all the doomsayers, we're going to slip into a recession and everything's going to change. We're not going to have any human contact anymore. And yet I sort of try to sort of don my FM mindset, or at least try and think of the sorts of things that he would say in and around this that aren't, I mean, because to me, a lot of people sort of framed him as sort of this sort of just this cavalier optimist. I mean, the FM that I knew, partly because I read his initial books and partly because I got to speak to him a lot, wasn't in the least bit cavalier about, oh, it's all going to be great. Oh, technology is going to solve everything. And I know that you and some of the people that I've met through you and around you aren't cavalier in the least. So what's your sort of sense of the effects or the things that this is going to create in and around this?
Yeah, great question. I mean, actually, I thought that you were asking about the contribution that the movie is going to make to the future. But if you're talking about what contribution the pandemic is going to make to the future, yes. So I've been thinking about that quite a bit. I believe that people, technological pioneers like myself, have a very big responsibility right now to be developing ways to educate decision makers as the pandemic gets under control, so as to ensure that the right lessons are properly learned and not just ignored. I think that it is too much to hope for that the general public will really substantially learn from this. I believe that the general public are pretty much certain to revert back to the status quo ante in terms of their thinking and just, the whole thing was a bad dream. But there's no reason why policymakers and decision makers in positions of power should do that necessarily. They, on the other hand, should be in a position to actually adopt measures that constitute improved rationality with regard to all of this. So that's true in the narrow sense of infections. It's been a complete scandal for decades that so little development has gone into vaccines, so little effort has gone into vaccine development and antibiotics and so on. There's masses of really promising technology out there that should be funded at least 100 times more than it actually is. And if it were, and if it had been, then a lot of lives would have been saved just now, which means that and there's a fair chance now of actually persuading the people who really make these decisions that that is the case, and therefore that this ought to happen now. Then if we go more broadly, we can look at aging, of course. We know that the coronavirus is hitting the elderly really, really hard. Of course, the elderly are hit harder than average by your average infection, but it's particularly steep in relation to the coronavirus. So this may, with a bit of luck, shine a greater light on the work that's going on to rejuvenate the immune system to the elderly, which is very promising now, and again, merits vastly more funding than it's actually getting, whether from the private sector or from the government. And then more broadly than that, I think we're talking really about rationality about healthcare in general, that we could potentially move to a situation in which it is recognized that the current reaction, the typical reaction to discussions about bringing aging under medical control is inappropriate. At the moment, when you talk to any politician about that, their first knee-jerk reaction is, oh God, how will we pay the pensions? And then they immediately switch their brains off and decide that this is a bad idea and they don't want to know about it anymore, right? So if we can now somewhat diminish that in favor of the principle that, healthcare is, there is an imperative to provide the best healthcare possible to all age groups, irrespective of the side effect of living longer that might occur, right? If we can get that into people's heads, even a little bit more than historically, then that will be a big silver lining.
That will be an amazing silver lining. Some of the themes that the film addressed in terms of healthcare in general, did any of those resonate? I mean, to me, they resonate a lot because Bill O'Reilly, I think, apparently, I see it, apparently said that this is a good thing that elderly people are dying because it's the natural order of things. My hope is that that voices like that are going to be marginalized. That's my hope, that you hear.
And I think that's definitely the case. I think that they're already being marginalized to some extent, because clearly one only needs to apply the most elementary logic in order to see that such arguments are nonsense, because, you know, it applies equally to the whole of technology. You know, nanotechnology is the natural order of things. But the reason that people get away with it in terms of aging is because the audience, in other words, everybody else, kind of wants to feel that aging is a blessing in disguise. So as I mentioned earlier, not to get your hopes up, right? And the more that we progress towards a situation in which medical control of aging is actually foreseeable, the more the argument of not getting one's hopes up is weakened, right? Because, you know, it becomes sensible to actually get your hopes up and work to hasten the defeat of aging so that you do actually benefit from it.
Do you see a shift? I mean, do you already see a shift in some of the voices out there?
Very
and
much.
what are the ones that give you hope?
Well, so actually, to be honest, the thing that gives me the most hope is the increased rarity of the more egregious pro-death, anti-aging voices. You know, you don't hear about Leon Kass saying, you know, death gives meaning to life anymore. You know, there are a few people out there who try to make these arguments, but they are rarer and rarer, and they are quieter and quieter, and that's, to me, the most important difference.
I keep thinking about these sort of world health bodies and how, you know, I mean, to me, even it's funny because there were people who've loved the movie, David Pierce, for example, and then there's people who I would consider well, everything's been politicized. Like transhuman is now political movement, and there are all these different factions, and people tend to try and see. I mean, the thing that you said earlier that I love is this thing about labels. Like, I don't think any labels really apply to me. I've become a label when sometimes to be provocative, less so because I think there are so many nuances in all this. And yet, even in these sort of futuristic movements, there seems to be sort of swings that are from political perspectives. How do we get past that? I guess is the sort of short is the.
I'm probably just not a good person to come up with a good answer to that question, because I definitely don't regard myself as a natural politician. In fact, I'm almost the opposite. I just don't understand the general public very well. And as such, you know, I recognize that people who do have better ability to get inside the heads of the man in the street and to, you know, to communicate with them are an essential component of what I want to do to improve the human condition, but it's something that I have to let other people take the lead on.
What as you see some of the media specifically, it's corona. I mean, I'm, you know, a friend of mine said to me, this couldn't be the most, you've got this sort of countercultural movement, which I never thought it was really. But I can see why somebody would say that when we're living in a world that seems very surreal.
I mean, I think everybody is responding to the crisis in their own way, psychologically. You know, some people are obviously in a much more challenging situation than others, either because they've got loved ones who are elderly and who've got severely, or because they've lost their livelihood or whatever. You know, so I don't think we can really generalize yet. You know, it's complicated.
But considering you brought it up before, I'll ask it. The sort of the effect of, it seems grandiose even to repeat it, the effect of this movie on the future, on our future, I mean, if any.
Of course, we will never know for a long time. You can never know when a particular event, whether it's a movie or anything else, has actually had a long-term, a lasting effect. But I would certainly, you know, say that there are such movies. You know, occasionally in history, there are movies that really make a difference. And, you know, if any movie is going to make a difference to our rationality about the future, you know, this one's got as good a chance as any.
That's nice. You know, the most surprising thing for me when we originally screened it at Woodstock was we had, well, number one, that people believed it. That I didn't expect so many people to believe it, because we kind of threw out some of the stuff towards the end. And I mean, it was the goal initially that we wanted to put people in that mindset of, shit, what if you could do this? What is going to be the effect? And let's hear voices pro and con, and let's see what happens. But so I didn't expect people to believe it hook, line and sinker by the end. But then there were sort of two camps. There was a camp that was really afraid. There was a woman, I can't remember at which of the screenings, who was like, oh my God, what's he like? This is so scary. And then there were these younger people, actually. I don't want to put it in both camps because I didn't have such a big focus group, who were like, wow, I want to meet him. Like, do you encounter both of those things as you talk about?
Well, sure. And I mean, I think actually one of the demonstrations of what a triumph this movie is precisely the fact that a respectable proportion of the people who saw it did actually believe that FM had actually been brought back, and therefore they naturally fell into these two polarized camps. You know, I think you needed to make it on the edge of believability in order to get people to really, you know, take it in and think about it properly. I would say that the people who understood that this had not actually happened would still have been put into a situation of thinking about it much more clearly, much more, you know, deeply, than if they had known it was, if it had been obvious to them from the first minute that it had not happened.
Well, it's funny, some of the comments even on the Amazon reviews is, you know, one of them is, this has got a very liberal worldview and blah, 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 which is, to me, are funny. But there's also these comments like, I thought this was a documentary, or this is a documentary. What I didn't see what happened at the end. I went through this whole I want my money back. So it's these two different. You're never going to please everybody, I guess, is the lesson.
But you didn't make the movie to please people. You made the movie to get people to think.
No, and we've had some really, I mean, and I should probably send you some of them, but some really nice responses from people who've really thought about these things that they'd never really thought about. And that was really, if there was any one goal, it was probably that.
Sure, totally.
People keep saying, please, what are they, people, stay safe. I don't really understand the stay safe business. I think it should be stay healthy or stay something else. Everybody keeps saying stay safe. So I don't know how to end this call exactly, except with a very sort of Spock-like end. Thank you. I mean, thank you for being such a help and a proponent of this film. And yeah, I hope, yeah, that's really all I think I've got. I think I've asked you pretty much. Well, actually, there's one other thing. I mean, I was very disappointed. I know you were too, because we were trying to get Wish You Were Here. And I remember thinking about well, a lot of the lines, but the particular line.
Yeah, a walk on part in a war or a lead role in a cage. Yeah.
Yes. So tell me about what that line means to you, because it definitely means a lot to me since you mentioned it to me, because I've really thought about it a lot. What does it mean to you?
It means, I could go on for half an hour about what this means to me. I mean, I was 12 when Wish You Were Here came out in 1975, and I probably didn't come across the song until I was 14 or 15, but it's been one of the most defining pieces of poetry for me throughout my life. You know, I've always been the kind of person who wants to make a difference to the world. And I mean, when I say always, I really mean even from that young age. And I always knew that if that's what you want to do with your life, then you're going to do things where you may succeed or you may fail, but at least you've tried. And that stanza really, you know, encapsulates that feeling that, you know, what is the point of doing stuff that, you know, of just being a follower, you know, of just doing what other people tell you all your life, even if you do become, you know, famous as a result. You know, so that phrase, that stanza just has been a defining description of how I've made my choices in life. You know, so if I look now at what I do, you know, I'm one of those extraordinarily lucky, rare, privileged people who've been able to get to the point of having a lead role in the war. But, you know, people like FM, just like me, you know, they have led their lives in that way, and they have advocated to lead one's life in that way. So, yeah, I was really, really pissed off that you couldn't get that song in the movie.
But there's also, I mean, it's funny because you've done both in a way. Like, I mean, it makes it binary in the song. I mean, there's like a binary choice. But when I sort of think about what you try to achieve,
well, that's what I said. That's what I'm saying. I have been able to get into the position of taking a lead role in the war, but you can't do that by choice. You can only get to that position by not only being talented and determined and charismatic and so on, but also by being extraordinarily lucky, right?
Well, I'm glad you. I mean, yeah, you look. Some people
what
think
you can do, but the point is, what you can do by choice is one or the other, right? You can definitely take a walk-on part in the war by choice.
Yeah, and how it pans out, you don't know. I mean, we just don't know.
I shouldn't care.
And I guess the other part that always that is more emotive is the sort of being okay with loss, which seems, I don't know if okay is the right word.
Well, if you say loss, do you mean failure?
No, I don't mean failure. I mean that you're not always going to get the achievement that you set out for, that you've got to be okay with the process and knowing that that process may have deficits.
Right, that's what I meant by failure. Yeah, that you know, it's all probabilistic. You've got to be happy that all you're doing is giving yourself the best chance of making a contribution.
Well, you've made a tremendous contribution, both to my movie, or to the movie, our movie, I would say, and I hope that it does do. I hope it does change, if more than just a few mindsets, and makes your work and the work of all these futurists that want to sort of build these props so that these things can happen. That's my hope, anyway.
Well, all I can say is thank you for making the movie.
Thank you, lovely Aubrey. Thanks a lot. So we'll figure out editing this and putting it up.
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Good
All right,
job.
be safe and healthy and whatever
Indeed.
else.
Indeed. Same to you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.